Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Aardvark Accessibility Podcast. My name is Natalie G. I'm an accessibility novice, and in today's episode, we have our guest,
Natalie MacLeese, accessibility expert.
and we're going to be talking about accessibility laws, at least the very popular ones.
Around the world.
Yes, around the world. We're not just going to talk about the US, we're going to talk about some other popular ones. So, to get started, what accessibility law do you feel kickstarted a lot of these?
I wonder what it could be. So a lot of disability laws around the world have their basis in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities passed by the United Nations in 2006, or the UN CRPD. And I have a nice quote from that law. All right. So the UN CRPD guarantees a lot of rights for persons with disabilities, but one of the main things that applies to websites is this nice little quote that access to information and communication is seen as a precondition for freedom of opinion and expression.
Mm-hmm. Yes, because in 2006, you started seeing a lot more internet usage.
For sure. Yeah. We were about 10 years into the internet being relatively commonly used by people in 2006.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I feel like that's around the time a lot of people started getting computers in their homes, I feel.
Yeah. Before that, it was a lot of early adopters. But yeah, by the early 2000s, it was really common to just have internet in your house and a computer that was connected to the internet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the computer room.
The computer room. I had a computer room.
Me too. We had our first computer room around that time.
Because your computer needed a whole room because it was enormous.
It had its dedicated spot. All right, so based on the United Nations, do you want to go and hop over to the United States?
Yeah, we can quickly run through some of the important federal legislation, which is not comprehensive at all because lots of states and local governments have passed their own accessibility laws, but kind of the important ones for US federal law is the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was passed in 1990. And where things get a little bit messy with the ADA is obviously in 1990, the internet didn't exist yet. We were just a little too early. And so there's no language in the bill itself that refers to websites. And it's been actually kind of contentious over the years on whether or not the ADA actually applies to websites or not. And there was a case involving Domino's Pizza and the ability of people who use screen readers to be able to order pizzas on their app or on their website. But aside from that, there haven't been any clear court case decisions, and the Supreme Court has mostly declined to hear important ADA website cases. So we're still in a little bit of a state of uncertainty. And then I think it was about 2 years ago, the Department of Justice finally did publish some guidelines saying that, yes, they thought that WCAG 2.0 AA did apply to websites, but we don't really know if that is going to stick until it's challenged in a court case. So there's still a little bit of a question there. And we should also say neither of us are lawyers. So we're not offering any kind of legal advice or anything like that. We're just doing a quick overview of these laws.
Yes. We are not lawyers.
Definitely not lawyers. No law school here. The other big federal law in the U.S. is the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And you might think, wait, there weren't websites in 1990. Now she's talking about 1973. But the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, Section 508, just says that when the federal government procures any kind of communications technology, that it has to be accessible. And the law was very general about that. And a website is definitely a communication technology. So that law definitely does apply to websites and other kinds of internet technology as well. And then there's also Section 504 of that act, which extends that criteria so it also applies to institutions that receive federal funding, must have accessible websites.
Mhm.
So those are the big like national ones in the United States, but of course there are literally like hundreds, if not thousands of others in the US accessibility laws all over the place.
Oh, really? Just like at different levels of government?
Yeah, different states have them, different cities, counties, etc. Yeah.
I want to backtrack to the ADA.
Okay.
Is there hesitation in not being clear with WCAG standards just because it will get messy? Like if they just suddenly declare like WCAG 2.0 for these websites, now they have to enforce it. Now they have all these new cases coming in.
Yeah, one of the tricky things with the ADA is that the only real enforcement built into it is lawsuits. So if a disabled person is unable to access a service, they have the right to file a lawsuit. There's no other enforcement. Like, you're not going to get a ticket from the government, right, saying you have to pay a fine if your website isn't accessible. That's just, it's not how that law is enforced. And so it's all about which lawsuits get through and which lawsuits are successful and how those decisions are made and how the precedent gets set.
Mm-hmm. So by leaving it muddy, they have less lawsuits, basically.
The part of it that's muddy is that it says that the law applies to, it is like a quote from the law, is places of public accommodation. Right. So a shop that's open to the general public is a place of public accommodation. And that's not under question. Like that's been decided over and over again in lawsuits. The question is a website a place of public accommodation? And there have been decisions that say yes, it is, and there have been decisions that say no, they are not at different levels of the courts, right? Because of course we have many levels of federal courts, but we're waiting for the Supreme Court to make a decision that says either yes, they are or no, they aren't before we actually know for sure.
Okay. But if they eventually do add that, it would fall under ADA still.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
They just have to make clarifications.
They need to make some clarifications, yes. And unfortunately, the way things work right now, those clarifications are getting made by lawsuit decisions, which is a little messy.
You know what I just realized?
What?
The internet doesn't have police.
No, it sure doesn't. It doesn't have borders. It doesn't have police. It's the wild, wild west out here. Look at, we'll let anybody have a podcast.
Yes. Yeah, so like if a website is not accessible, they can't just get a ticket. There's no little police flagging you down.
No.
Pull over. Pull over.
No. Yeah. And there's no, right, like you put up a website, anybody in the world can get to it. So like what country's laws apply to it? You don't need to go get a license or a permit to have a website. Anybody can set up a website.
Yeah. That's an interesting problem because aside from lawsuits, what other ways could you really enforce that?
Yeah, it's really hard.
If you're watching on YouTube and you have any good ideas, leave them in the comments below. I'm curious to see what everyone else thinks. I don't think we should have an internet police.
I don't think we should have internet police either.
But it's an interesting question. Think about it. And then I think for the Rehabilitation Act, I had a question. Oh, no, not a question. I would say that there's a lot more federal funded organizations than you would think, because I didn't realize universities were involved or hospitals.
Education at all levels, really.
Mm-hmm. Community
universities,
colleges.
All kinds of high schools, elementary schools, kindergartens, preschools. Yeah. Almost all of them receive some kind of federal funding. Yeah.
I wanted to just throw that out there because it's more common than that you would expect.
Yeah, and a lot of nonprofit organizations receive a significant amount of federal funding.
Oh, yes, that's true. That's true.
Yeah, it is way more than you would expect.
All right. That's the US, you guys. We still have a bunch more others to go through, so let's.
Yeah, but we'll go faster because we don't live there and we know less.
Yeah, we're not international lawyers either, if you guys were wondering.
Yeah.
All right. What about European Union? Do you want to go over that one?
Yeah, we'll talk about that one real quick because the EU has a big accessibility act that is going into becoming active, I guess, in June of this year. So just a few months from now. It was passed in 2019, but humans are bad at planning. So I think a lot of people are going to be scrambling in these last few months. But it does require that digital and physical goods and services are accessible, including things like ATMs, websites, ticketing machines, kiosks, things like that. And that is WCAG 2.1 AA.
So if you guys need to scramble and get your website audited and remediated, stick around to the end and we'll let you know what you can do. Yes, but I wrote a little note. That's a little baby act. It was just born. I feel like some of
Brand
these others
new. Yeah.
here for a while.
Yeah, for sure.
Let's go over Canada.
Yeah, Canada. So Ontario actually kicked off Canada's laws. They had an AODA law, but now they have a federal law. Accessible Canada Act came around in 2019. They want a barrier-free Canada by 2040, which is a lovely goal to have. And that applies to federally regulated organizations. So not actually government institutions, but things like banks and things like that are also included in that law and must have accessible websites, accessible apps, things like that. And they do have a penalty from the government if they don't comply. It's much less litigious country than the US.
Yeah. So they do have an internet police?
I guess kind of.
Yeah, and the penalties can reach up to 250,000 Canadian bacons.
Canadian bacons.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Canadian dollars. All right. UK.
UK, famously no longer part of the EU.
I didn't know that.
You don't remember all the Brexit drama?
No. Was it
Oh, they were
recently?
in the EU and they left. Yes, it was recently. I don't know, like maybe 10 years ago?
Oh, Natalie, come on. Not recently.
All right. Well, they were in the EU and now they're not. So they have their own law that says websites and mobile apps have to adhere to WCAG 2.1 AA, and that applies to government and public sector websites.
So the UK enacted it in 2010, so I'm guessing it was before they separated from the United Nations.
Yeah, I think that would have been before because I think it was around like 2015 or so that they separated,
Okay.
if I remember correctly.
Do you think that their Equality Act kind of got grandfathered in from the United Nations? Oh wait.
Oh, lots of the countries that are in the EU have their own accessibility law that applies to just their country, in addition to this new one that's going into effect this year. In fact, most of them already had some kind of accessibility law. Yeah.
Because the United Nations was 2006, and then UK. Yeah, I'm getting confused with the timelines now. United Nations 2006, UK.
The CRPD, you mean?
Yeah.
Yes.
And then UK 2010 with their own law on top of the United Nations.
On
And
top
then,
of CRPD, yeah.
and then they broke off, but they just kept their own law.
Well, the United Nations, the CRPD isn't a law, and it's just basically a statement of rights that people with disabilities have. And the UN, right, has very limited ability to impose laws on the countries that belong to the UN. It's just kind of all the countries agreeing, like, yes, we all agree that this that this is the case.
Yes, that is true. The United Nations is just not impose laws. Okay, European watchers,
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. I'm very uninformed on world policies and laws. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, but I hope that timeline made sense to everyone. That's how I was kind of thinking
Yeah.
about it. I was like, wait, what is going on? All right, we're good.
Okay. All right. I see.
Next is Australia.
Australia. Yay. As they have Australia's Disability Discrimination Act, or the DDA, came around in 1992, and WCAG 2.1 AA for digital content for websites and apps included under goods and services. So helps guarantee access to employment, information, education, etc.
I wonder if areas of employment kind of applies to like LinkedIn and Indeed.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah, job application processes that are all online now. Yeah, those all need to be accessible.
Interesting. So, in cases like that, would the Australian government reach out to LinkedIn and Indeed, like public companies like that?
Yeah, that's where it gets hard because there's no internet police, right? Because LinkedIn is an Australian company. So
Mhm.
they would not typically be under any kind of jurisdiction for Australian laws. But if their website is accessible in Australia, do the Australian laws apply?
Leave your comment below. We'd like to.
That's where it gets a little bit messy, right? The internet doesn't have borders, it doesn't have police, it doesn't have laws. So how do we enforce these things? How is the EU going to enforce all the other websites that people access in the EU that are not companies based in the EU? Right? You can still go, if eBay is an American company, but if I'm in Germany, I can go on eBay and I can buy stuff.
Mhm. And then on top of that, you have VPNs, right?
Yeah. Yeah, you can trick a website into thinking you're somewhere that you're not.
Anyway,
But there
it's a
are many, 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 many others. So this is Western Europe and most of the English speaking world, but there are laws in many, many, many other countries. So we'll include a link to Lady Feingold's repository of information on laws, disability laws around the world.
We'll put a link in the description below. She has a huge long list of all the countries that include accessibility laws and more information and links to resources
Yeah.
if you're curious. So we went over some of the laws. How does this impact websites? Like what should website owners keep in mind?
Well, if you're a US based company, you do need to keep in mind that if your website is not accessible, somebody might try to sue you for it because that is how we enforce the ADA. So you do want to make sure that your website is accessible. I don't think, to me, that's more important to do because it's helpful for people and you want to do the right thing and provide equal access to information and services for everybody regardless of their ability, and that's the more important reason to do it. But there is also a legal reason that you would want to make sure that your websites are accessible. There's around 1 in 4 people in the United States has some kind of disability, so I can't think of any business who doesn't want to increase business by 25%. So that's another good reason to go ahead and do it.
And not only that, I mean, overall accessibility improvements, they improve it for everybody visiting your site.
They do. Yeah. It makes a better user experience for everybody and gives you better SEO.
Yep. Who doesn't want better search engine results? All right. Last thing I will mention, we'll link to the Robles versus Domino's case down in the description below. And with that, we will end the podcast with some information on where you can go if you're curious about making your website accessible.
Yeah, if you want to find out how you're doing, what your website might be looking like, you can go to aardvarkaccessibility.com and try Aardvark for free on your homepage. It'll run an automated scan, let you know about some accessibility issues that are on there. If you're an accessibility professional, we also have some nice tools for conducting manual audits, make it easier to record issues that you find and track them through to resolution.
Mm-hmm. So, with that, thank you guys for watching this podcast. We covered the accessibility laws, the really popular ones that we in English speaking countries. There's a lot more, so go check them out. And yeah, that's about it. That's our 10th episode. And we're signing off. That's it. Join us next time for another episode of the Aardvark Accessibility Podcast. And now for our YouTube viewers, we're going to do a pose to get our thumbnail.
To celebrate the end of the podcast.
Yes, to celebrate the end of the podcast. And I think this time I want to do another emoji.
Okay.
I want to do the peeking through emoji with your hand. Like, yeah, like this. That's about it. And with that, we cut.